Good morning, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the World Affairs Council of Orange County. We have a very insightful and important subject today titled Fractured Himalaya, Understanding India-China Bilateral Relations. My name is Rick Putnam, co-chair of the Programs Committee at the World Affairs Council. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees, we want to thank our members, partner organizations, and guests for joining us today. We'll start the program in a moment, but first a couple of reminders. And first, as you know, we are a non-political, non-partisan organization, and we'll maintain that in our subject matter discussions and in the participation of our audience. So I thank you in advance for assisting us with that. Secondly, and speaking of you, our audience, we want these sessions to be participatory, as you know, so please use the Q&A or chat functions at the bottom of your screen to post your questions of our speakers today. We will collect those for a Q&A session in the last 5 to 10 minutes of the program, and we certainly hope to get to each and every one. So please be free in your use of that facility. So with that, I'll make some brief introductions. Please forgive me for my brevity so we can get to the program. First off, our moderators today include Lisa Curtis, who is a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She's a foreign policy and national security expert with over 20 years of service in the US government, including at the NSC, CIA, State Department, and Capitol Hill. Her work has centered on US policy towards the Indo-Pacific and South Asia, with a particular focus on US-India strategic relations in the Quad. Ms. Curtis has published commentary in foreign policy, the national interest, CNN.com, NPR, and other media outlets, and has made multiple appearances on all of the national networks. Also joining us as moderator today is Dr. Clayton Dube, or Clay. He's the director of the US-China Institute at the University of Southern California and at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. As the director of the USC US-China Institute since 2006, Clay oversees a variety of research, training, and outreach initiatives. He first lived and taught in China in 1982 to 1985, and as a historian, he examines how economic and political change in China since 1900 has affected the lives of ordinary people. One interesting comment about Clay is that prior to coming to USC, he led several UCLA Asia Institute programs. And finally, to introduce our guest today, Ms. Nirupama Rao, Ambassador. She is the former Indian Foreign Service Officer and retired as Foreign Secretary to the Government of India, the most position in the Foreign Service, and being the second woman to occupy the post from 2009 to 2011. She was Ambassador of India to the United States from 2011 to 2013, and in retirement, she has taught at various universities in the States. She's also a fellow at the India-China Institute of the New School in New York in 2016, the Public Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. in 2017, and Pacific Leadership Fellow at the School of Global Politics and Strategy, University of California at San Diego in 2019. She is, interestingly, a staunch believer in the power of social media as an advocacy platform for policy and currently has over 1.3 million followers on Twitter. Ambassador, welcome to our event today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. And thanks to the World Affairs Council of Orange County for inviting me to moderate this wonderful panel. It's just such a pleasure to be here today with Ambassador Rao. I first met Ambassador Rao when she served as Indian Ambassador to the United States several years ago. And so it's great to be back here with you, Ambassador Rao. And of course, we're discussing her landmark book, The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, and China from 1949 to 1962. And I think her timing for publishing this book could not be better. just 1 year after the Galwan Valley border crisis between Indian and Chinese troops. This crisis, where 20 Indian soldiers and at least 4 PLA soldiers were killed, was the first time that we saw loss of life on their disputed border since 1975. I was actually serving as senior director at the National Security Council for South and Central Asia. And at this time, and the US took this crisis very seriously, and the United States extended full diplomatic and material support to India. And I think that US-India relations really did deepen as a result of the US response to this crisis. And so while the Chinese and Indian militaries have pulled back from many of the places where they had built up their troops in 2020, they still retain high numbers of forces along that disputed frontier. And there are several flashpoints that could erupt into another border crisis at any time. And of course, the situation for India has become even more fraught with the signing of the historical Russia-China Pact on February 4th of this year. This 5,000-word manifesto is the strongest statement on Russia-China relations in over 70 years. It talks about a, quote, new redistribution of power in the world. So the joint statement certainly signals Presidents Putin and Xi's belief that the time is right to join forces to try to counter US global power and influence. So at a time like this, with such tectonic shifts in geopolitics, India being one of the centers of these changes that we're seeing, I think that Ambassador Rao's book really is indispensable reading for people who want to understand the history of India and China's relationships, and in particular, that period in the run-up to the 1962 war, which was so defining for India's policy toward China today. And of course, the details about Tibet and how that factors in to India-China relations. I've seen no other book that goes into such great detail about this. So it's informative, it's fascinating, and I'm just delighted to be here today to talk with you, Ambassador Rao, about it. So thank you for writing this, Ambassador Rao. Thank you for sharing your enormous expertise, your practical experience. I think you've done a public service for everyone. But I'd like to ask you, what motivated you to write the book, and how do you hope it impacts Indian, Chinese, and US policymakers that are now focused on these issues?
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. And let me first of all express my gratitude to the World Affairs Council, to Rick Putnam, to Naseem Kader for making this discussion possible today on my book. Thank you so much. To answer your question, Lisa, as to what prompted me to write this book, I had always desired to write a book of this nature. First of all, I had, been deeply immersed in the study of the India-China relationship from its inception, the modern India-China relationship from its inception. I started work on this as a young diplomat in the mid-80s, 1980s. And back then in the Ministry of External Affairs, they wanted some career diplomats, at least one like me, to specialize on India-China relations, particularly border affairs between the two countries, the unresolved border between the two countries. You see, prior to the War of 1962, we had a historical division in the Ministry of External Affairs, which was headed by none other than the very eminent historian, Dr. S. Gopal, whom you must have heard of. And he had put together all the evidence, as we called it, from the Indian side relating to our case on the boundary dispute. By the time I joined the Foreign Service and I was settling into my career, those experts had vanished from the scene. Either they had passed on or they had retired. So the ministry wanted a young generation of diplomats to start work on this. And that's how I was drawn into this. And I enjoyed it very much from get-go. I have always been fascinated by just the Himalayas and the stories that they tell us, and as an Indian, and also by Tibet. I met the Dalai Lama as a very young child when he came into India in 1959. And that also, I think, in some ways prompted me to join the Foreign Service. By the time I was 12, I had made up my mind that I was going to be a diplomat. So all these factors, I think, made me kind of want to write a book of this nature, not only because of my own involvement with the subject and the fact that I felt comfortable about writing it, but also because in India, a whole younger generation has grown up with not much knowledge about what led to the disputes with China. And I felt the story had to be written from that point of view also. And then you brought up the issue of Galwan in your introductory remarks. I thought it would be very topical, very timely for me to write a book like this, because what is happening on the Western Front in Ladakh, with these numerous pockets of difference between India and China as to where the line of actual control should lie, also brings before us the necessity to understand what this dispute is about and why it has a kind of flared up again with the tragic deaths of soldiers in Galwan in June 2020. So yes, we live in a world of tectonic shifts in geopolitics as we see today. And I think the India-China relationship is very much at the core of some of these changes that we see.
Absolutely. I think that's certainly true. I think when you were serving as ambassador in the United States, it was at that time that we were just starting to see the border tensions between India and China sort of rekindle after laying dormant for 50, 60 years. So you were ambassador at a very critical time. And of course, things have heated up even more so since then. I want to go back into the history a little bit. You spend some time in the book criticizing India's absence of a grand strategy vis-a-vis China back in the 1950s. You indicate that India may have lost an opportunity to more clearly define the borders early after independence, after India's independence. You also criticized the Tibet Agreement with China of 1954 and say that it proved costly to India later on. Can you talk in depth about the mistakes that you believe India made in the run-up to the 1962 war and how India may have avoided conflict with China at the time?
First of all, I believe that at the time of our independence in 1947, we essentially inherited unsettled frontiers. I don't call them borders because, borders presuppose agreements between two adjacent countries as to where the separating line between, their two nations should actually lie. And that had not happened between India and China. The British had explored the frontier, and you have stories and histories of very masculine adventurers who explored the Himalayas, who suggested various lines of separation with China. But none of them had either been agreed to between the two nations, nor had they been actually, settled in any way in order to call them defined borders. And that's what we inherited from the British at the time of our independence. And the Chinese too, there is a lot of literature that has come out about the borders that we share with China and our own policy, especially under Prime Minister Nehru. There are many recent books also that have dealt with it. But I think it is important to place these in perspective, because as much as we had not inherited determined frontiers with China, the Chinese themselves had very little knowledge of where the frontier with India should lie. So in a sense, the arena was open either for occupation, physical occupation by either country of whatever territory it had easy access to, or you can argue conversely that the arena was open for the two countries to really settle this border, settle this frontier, and draw a border between themselves. And I think the first option perhaps was pursued with much more alacrity by each of us. But the second option as to settling the border was not pursued. And those are the missed opportunities that I refer to in my narrative. The Tibet Agreement that you mentioned was one such occasion where I believe the border could have been discussed between India and China. You see, when India became independent, it inherited certain positions and privileges in Tibet from the British Raj. And with with the establishment of the People's Republic and the entry of the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, into Tibet in 1950-51, the need to renegotiate those rights and privileges concerning India and Tibet became at the front and center of the relationship. And that is how the Tibet Agreement was negotiated, in which India essentially conceded that Tibet was a region of China. I mean, we conceded Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. Now, Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, the Chinese will, of course, argue vociferously and very passionately that they always exerted sovereignty over Tibet. But I think the reality is somewhat gray and murky as to the extent of the Chinese control that was exercised historically in Tibet and prior to the Chinese PLA entering Tibet. But leaving that aside, I think the opportunity did present itself in 1954 when we negotiated that agreement over Tibet with China to also talk about the border between the two countries. And somehow from our side, from the Indian side, it was felt, and that was how Prime Minister Nehru took that decision, some sections of the bureaucracy who had the capacity to influence the Prime Minister's opinion recommended that we should not raise the question of the border. Why? Because the Chinese had not raised it with us, so it was better to let sleeping dogs lie. Secondly, that this was unlikely to be a bone of contention between the two countries, which was not the case, as the Chinese archives now reveal. The Chinese decided that they were not prepared to discuss the border, or that it was not ripe for settlement, as the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai put it, because they were themselves studying the records. They were themselves in conversation with the Tibetan officials in Lhasa about the whole history of the frontier, and they were building that highway from Xinjiang to Tibet across what territory that India regarded as its own in the Aksai Chin, very close, to Galwan and, the various places along the Western Front, where today we have a very near kinetic situation facing the Chinese.
That
was one of the missed opportunities. My book talks of many others.
Yes. No, that's very interesting. Hindsight is always 2020, because yes, of course, now India would very much like to delimit the border and settle it, and the Chinese, are just failing to move forward in that regard and see it.
In that sense, India, I think, would favor a definition of the line of actual control, I believe. But as far as a border settlement is concerned, Lisa, having dealt with it for so many years, and now I am freed of my official, obligations and all the, responsibilities that I held at one time. I really have concluded at the end of all this and all these years of studying the subject that unless, there is give and take between the two countries, we are not going to be able to settle this. So in that sense, I don't believe neither India nor China is ready to settle this. But if we want peace along the border, at least the line of actual control needs to be quiet, and the confrontation of the like that we have seen since 2020, especially in Ladakh, has to come to an end with proper disengagement, de-escalation, and definition of the line of actual control.
So some scholars, actually, your former colleague, former Indian Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, has talked about how he thinks there's still a small window of opportunity for India and China to find a new equilibrium, that it, it doesn't have to devolve to conflict between the two. However, he talks about how this window is closing, and that he adds some urgency to India and China finding this balance between competition and cooperation. Do you think that, the 2020 crisis has really changed the game, or do you think there is still potential for India and China to find this equilibrium so that we could avoid conflict in the future?
Well, I don't think India and China should give up on that quest for the equilibrium that you just referred to. It's most important. And secondly, I believe between India and China, although there are so many differences and tensions between the two countries today, competition, potential conflict, I think at the heart of this relationship between two large Asian countries, there is no fundamental contradiction. It's very different from the relationship we share with Pakistan, which is, a question of blood, a question of partition, a question of shared histories. It's so much more complex and complicated to try and resolve the differences that we have with Pakistan. But in the case of China, the differences, really speaking, have had the possibility of being resolved for many, many decades. Over the years, that window, as you just said, has become smaller and smaller, partly because China has become so much more powerful, more revanchist, you could say, more demanding, more aspirational, more aggressive. All those characteristics are Chinese today, I think one would say. And in the case of India also, as we've grown economically more prosperous, and there's been more awareness of, our territorial integrity and the need to protect it, the need to fight off the foreigners who seek to occupy India's sovereign land. With that, I think also the capacity to arrive at negotiated settlements that involve give and take, that involve mutual accommodation and adjustment, has become also so much more difficult. But I believe that if with strong leaders like Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, if we can revive something of that Wuhan spirit that we saw after Doklam, where the two leaders talk to each other, begin a process of dialogue, and take the decision at that highest level to seek a settlement, I believe it's still possible.
Great, great. I love that optimism. I think we just have time for one more question until we move to Dr. Dube. But I would really love to hear you talk about what's currently happening in terms of the U.S.-Indian divergence over Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And I talked at the beginning about the historical pact between Russia and China. So Russia certainly is part of this India-China equation. But can you talk to us about why there is, such a divergence? What are India's reasons for, pulling its punches regarding, not criticizing Russia's invasion, voting to abstain from all of the votes at the UN that seek to criticize Russia? Can you talk to us about that? And whether you think this balance is sustainable between the U.S. and India, the bilateral relationship. Of course, the U.S. and India just had very successful 2+2 meetings where India's foreign minister and defense minister engaged with their counterparts here. Lots of bilateral issues discussed, lots of good announcements. So clearly the United States values its partnership with Russia, or with India, excuse me, and doesn't want Russia to come between, their differences over Russia to come between the US and India. But I would just love to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, thank you. You know, after the Galwan tragedy, this whole triumvirate of Russia, India, and China, I think, came to occupy a little more prominence and a little more attention. And it was seen as Russia's attempt to draw the two countries together, at least to provide that forum where there could be dialogue and communication between the two literally warring sides. So in that sense, you know, the context in which Russia has been more visible on the India-China relationship front, you have seen after Galwan. But Russia and China have grown much closer together, as you referred to that 5,000-word document that communique issued in February, which is, you know, quite remarkable in its description of the nature of the relationship that the two countries want to build, the limitless partnership, as it's called. So, you know, that kind of relationship, that kind of closeness between and proximity between Russia and China obviously speaks of a Russia that, well, today is a junior partner to China, and because of various reasons, which we need not go into, but what points to the possibility that in the event of kinetic situations involving conflict between India and China, it raises questions of what Russia's position will be on these issues. So that, I'm sure, is a matter of disquiet in New Delhi for our policy makers. But coming to the India-Russia relationship, now I have my own views on India's position on Ukraine, but since I don't occupy any official position, I think that as far as the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is concerned, as far as the invasion really of Ukraine by Russia is concerned, I think India, given its position, given its power, given its being an influencer, let's say, of opinions on these matters as the world's largest democracy, can and could afford to speak out a little more unequivocally on what it sees as the rights and wrongs of this whole situation. It's not enough, perhaps, to just say that Russia was provoked into taking action that it did in Ukraine. But the fact is, did Russia cross an international frontier? Did Russia violate the UN Charter? To all these questions, I think the answer is really yes. And I believe that India can afford to speak a little more unequivocally on these matters, even as the relationship with Russia is valuable to us because of the fact that we have a long-standing defense connection with Russia, and a lot of our operational equipment in our armed forces comes from Russia. The planes we fly, the ships we use to navigate the oceans around us, and the ground equipment that our army uses, whether it's artillery or armor. So the connections are very, very strong, and obviously we have to maintain that, given the fact that we have as yet not built up sufficient capacity on our side or developed relationships with other countries that could, in a sense, substitute for what we are doing with Russia. So those things are very difficult to disengage from, so that connection has been maintained. I think the United States understands this aspect of India's connections with Russia, and the 2+2 meetings that you referred to, and what President Biden had to say to Prime Minister Modi, all that pointed to the bedrock of a relationship between our two democracies that is essentially stable, that is essentially defined by mutual understanding and mutual sensitivity, and is projected to grow stronger and stronger. It's an upward trajectory, and I don't believe that has been affected by what has happened in Ukraine or the kind of stand that India took at the United Nations or, you know, at the various councils, you know, in which opinions had to be expressed. So it is a difficult situation. I don't believe anybody could have foreseen this. Nobody foresaw the pandemic. Nobody foresaw what is happening in the heart of Europe, literally in Ukraine. It's a dreadful situation. And I think the people in India, and if you see much of the reporting in our TV channels and our print media, there is a lot of sympathy for Ukraine and perhaps more understanding of the actions of Russia having directly led to this humanitarian crisis. So I can't say much more, but I believe the discussion in our parliament recently, I think, was very telling. Nobody really came forward to sing paeans of praise to Russia. That was certainly not at all in evidence. I think some of the MPs said, you know, if a friend commits an offense, true friendship is your ability to tell that friend that he or she has done wrong, obviously referring to Russia.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Rao. I'm afraid even though I could go on discussing this directly with you, it's now Dr. Dube's turn to discuss it with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Always a pleasure.
And this is a pleasure for all of us. And thank you so much for carving out time late in the evening in India to share your experience and your views with the live audience and the people who will be watching the video later. So thanks, Ambassador Rao, for joining us, for giving us this book upon which to draw. Thanks to the World Affairs Council for making this possible. And thanks to those of you who are with us right now. And I want to remind you that you can participate. We've already received one excellent question from an audience member, and we will have time in a few minutes to hear from more of you. So please take advantage of that Zoom tool, click on the Q&A button and type in your question and we'll get to it. Ambassador Rao, thank you again. I'd like to draw on your deep historical knowledge of, you know, India and China relations, but also India's place in the world. So much of this comes through in this book. It's so very rich. I'd also like to ask you, as your, you know, given your extensive 4-decade career as a foreign service officer, as the leading diplomat in these major countries, to draw on that. And I want to tap into your sensibility as someone who believes in person-to-person diplomacy, the use of social media, cultural exchanges, all of those sorts of things. And we need to try and do that in a relatively short period of time. So first, if I may, a historical question. You take us deep into the 1950s when we have these two young governments, old civilizations, oldest civilizations anywhere, but young governments. And part of me thinks we should cut them some slack, that this issue on the frontier, so distant from the capitals and far from population centers, might not have occupied the mind, the space in the leaders' minds that we wish it had, and that they had gotten down to it. And in that moment, in the 1950s, where there was space for, you know, conciliatory measures, something might have been done to come up with a recognized boundary. And you tell us so well in this book about Prime Minister Nehru and the other major actors. And part of what I take away is when things go bad, in 1958, 1959, and finally 1962, there's such profound disappointment. And part of what you've written about is the emotional connection that the Prime Minister had with an imagined China. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because you write so eloquently about the importance of emotion, the importance of this sensibility, and you've just touched upon that with regard to Ukraine, and cold-hearted realism, rationality, reason. And maybe you could say a little bit more about how that plays out during this key period in the India-China relationship.
Yeah, that's the wonderful questions that you've raised, Clay. I'll try my best to answer them. I believe that at the dawn of our respective nationhoods as independent countries, or countries that had emerged on the world scene, India and China, in the late 1940s, and in the early 1950s, when we, first encountered each other in the modern form. I'm not talking of the ancient relationship that everybody speaks of, the civilizational relationship. But in terms of geopolitics, two geographies and two political systems literally coming up against each other. Just as the Himalayas crashed into the Tibetan plate, I think the India-China relationship also came to acquire that sense of a velocity that needed to be controlled, but perhaps in the end was not. I believe that in the early years of our independence and China's, the People's Republic of China's existence, the two nations, the two leaders had many opportunities to settle this frontier. But I think particularly on the Chinese side, not much attention was paid to settling the border with China in the early years when they entered Tibet. And they knew very little, they knew nothing. Many scholars in China have admitted to me that they knew very little of that frontier. In fact, they knew very little of those regions, the peripheries, the strategic peripheries of China, particularly Tibet. But in the case of India, I believe since we had inherited a lot of not just documents and historical records from the British, but many of our senior officials at the time of independence had worked with the British in the civil service and knew about our Himalayan borders, had served, some of them had crossed over the Himalayas into China as part of their work missions. When you take the senior Mr. K.P.S. Menon, who wrote this wonderful book called Chungking Diary, his work in the wartime capital of Chungking, or Chongqing as it's called today, and how he reached Chongqing by this trek and this very adventurous journey, literally reminiscent of Xuanzang and others, across the Himalayas into China. So there was knowledge, and there was, as you know, as far as the Indians are concerned, we have this emotional connect, which goes far beyond geopolitics with the Himalayas. The Himalayas, in a sense, define our geobody on the north. When you talk of Mother India, you talk of, this lady with flowing tresses, and the flowing tresses are essentially the Himalayas and the rivers that emanate in the Himalayas, particularly the holy Ganga, as you know. So that emotional connect was very much there. And Nehru, our first prime minister, as you know, was a writer, was a scholar. I wouldn't call him a historian, but he had published a number of books, defining the idea of India. And a lot of it was bound up, I believe, with the sense of the mountains that tower above us and how we draw our strength from them. So when he spoke in 1950-51 about the McMahon Line being our border, map or no map, I believe deep down there was this instinctive grasp of where our frontiers should lie, that they should lie along the highest crest, that they should lie on the highest crest or watershed of the Himalayas. So I think that realization was very much that awareness was very much in Nehru's mind. And also the fact, I think deep down, he also anticipated that this could be a source of conflict with China. that ultimately, you know, this challenge across the spine of Southeast Asia, and today you could translate it across Asia, would be the challenge that India and China posed to each other. And therefore, I think from the Indian side, the need to define the border along the highest crest of the Himalayas was very much there, which led Nehru, after the Tibet Agreement of 1954, to take that unilateral decision to show the boundaries on our maps as fixed and determined. So you see that. I think the Chinese at that stage perhaps were a little more open to the idea of having a border settlement that would have involved some bit of exchange or perhaps relinquishment of claims. Let's put it that way.
Well, and you make it very clear just now with your description and also in the book that you don't want to give up something that you don't really understand. Maybe there's something there that I really want to have and may not want to give up. And so on the Chinese side, where there's much less awareness there, as you describe in the book, many of the officials stay in place after the transfer from Britain to India and that sort of thing. So the Indian knowledge is much deeper for that area than the knowledge in Nanjing and then later in Beijing would have been. And so there's that kind of reluctance. And so you describe so powerfully just now the role of the Himalayas in the Indian mindset and how important it is. And so it has this tremendous symbolic value and importance. But many people would argue today that the resources of the Himalayas with regard to water, such a precious commodity for 500 million people in India, 500 million people in China, that these resources are now so critical, especially with the melting ice cap and all of those sorts of things. So could you say something beyond the symbolism that this represents and something more about what it means strategically, what it means economically? Because again, for many people outside the region, why argue about the mountaintops?
Right. Well, I spoke about the emotional connect, but there is a strategic defining of where our borders should lie. And, you know, even as we fault India's first Prime Minister Nehru for having not been able to really take decisions that would have, quote unquote, safeguarded the Indian interest vis-a-vis China, my book brings out the fact that when the Chinese armies entered Tibet in 1950, 1951, one of the momentous decisions that India took was to extend Indian administration into the town of Tawang in what is today Arunachal Pradesh, along the northeastern frontier. And the consolidation of Indian administration in what was then the Northeast Frontier Agency from the early 50s onwards was essentially a strategic decision because you needed a defensible frontier with China. Forget the emotional aspect, forget, you know, all the calendars that speak about the Himalayas, all the colorful images in our minds. There was a strategic need to have that defensible frontier because with the partition of India and the creation of, at that time, the two West and East Pakistan, today Bangladesh, the connectivity to northeastern India became so limited and so narrow that the defense of our frontiers, northern frontiers with China in that region became most important, not only with Sikkim, but also what is today Arunachal Pradesh. So we did make strategic moves. And I think it was one of the wisest moves that we made in the early years of our nationhood, the consolidation of Indian administration up to the McMahon line. I mean, we need not call it by that, up to what is today the international boundary between India and China in the region. In Ladakh, where we have all these problems over the line of actual control today, the same thing did not happen. The nature of the terrain was different. And I think in everybody's mind at that point in our history, perhaps there was this approach that the Aksai Chin, and I'm talking about before 1959, before 1958, when we discovered that the Chinese had built a road. I think India in the early stages was prepared to discuss this with China and perhaps come to an understanding where, we would have been able to arrive at a mutual settlement of each other's claims in the area. But that didn't happen. China was prepared and at that juncture in our history to settle the eastern frontier on the basis of realities. They didn't want to refer to it as the McMahon Line, but just as they did with Burma, they wanted the line to be referred to by any other name, but they were prepared to recognize current realities, which was the extension of Indian administration right up to the line. But India, somehow public opinion had hardened once the highway was discovered, and Nehru had taken that very precipitate decision after 1954 to show our boundaries as defined on our maps. And once you have maps that are published with fixed, as so-called determined, I would say, or at least to the normal eye, to the normal untutored eye, as something fixed and set in stone, it becomes very difficult for a parliamentary democracy then to say that, we can discuss these lines because in the first place, you're saying these are fixed, determined lines, and now you say you're prepared to discuss it. There are quandaries there, there are contradictions there, which I believe we still have not been able to resolve.
Now, you've made a wonderful set of points just now about how governing systems are part of the discussion, that when public opinion can be such a powerful factor with the publication of maps and things like that, then you're actually giving something up that people can imagine, people can see, and then your opponents can hold you accountable for, right? So there are those other issues. Now, 7,000 people were killed, wounded, lost in that 1960, the very brief 1962 war. It was catastrophic. It had a major impact on India-China perceptions of each other and their readiness to do any number of things. After the 1950s, that really does change things, and it only begins to change later. Now, this most recent hand-to-hand combat, one could argue, although the body count is so much smaller, so much lower, the stakes are so much higher. These are nuclear powers. These are countries, the second and fifth or sixth largest economies in the world. And both of them are major world players. And both of them have complicated relations with other folks in the neighborhood and beyond. And so maybe you could say something about where we are today. Now, you've already said, about the hardening lines, the narrowing windows, that sort of thing. Can you say something more about the stakes in the relationship? One of the amazing things is, despite these tensions, trade has expanded. We had the ban on TikTok and things like that in 2020, but there's still a lot of business going on.
Absolutely. The relationship between India and China today is a very different one from what obtained in the 1950s. In the 1950s, of course, you had this whole atmosphere of so-called friendship and amity between the two countries, two nations rediscovering each other, as it were. And, the slate or the map, if you can call, the relationship a map, it was a pretty unexplored map at that point of time. And 1962 closed the window also, window of our relations with Tibet, because we had a consulate in Lhasa until 1962. And India decided that we should terminate the agreement with China on Tibet the 1954 agreement in 1962. And we gave up that presence in Tibet. Incidentally, the Nepalese are the only, Nepal is the only country to have a consulate in Lhasa today, as you know. But India was the other country. And I think it's an enormous pity that we gave up that presence. And interestingly, up until the late 1980s, the Chinese were willing for India to restore that consulate, but their position after the 80s has hardened so deeply that there's no question, I think, of that window or that door being opened. China's, Tibet's back door, literally, that back door has closed. Where today the relationship with China is something that we built up, both countries, I think, in a concerted way, from the late 1980s onwards, after the visit of then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1988, where India agreed with China that we should develop relations in all areas, even as we seek a settlement to the boundary question. So the boundary was not placed out there as an obstacle to the development of relations in other fields. But what has changed now with Galwan and the military to military confrontation and loss of life that occurred there is that India wants a return to the status quo along the line of actual control before we can think of relations being normal. As the foreign minister says, relations will not be normal as long as the situation along the LAC is abnormal. So that's where we are today. We have a huge relationship with China, huge amount of trade. The two economies have interacted with each other very closely and in numerous ways over the last decade and a half. People-to-people ties have grown. Just the connectivity has grown between the two countries, although the Chinese, I think, know less about India than we Indians know about China. The Chinese, or China today, I think, has more than a little bit of hubris and its desire to be out there, the front-ranking world power with the United States. That has become a compulsive, obsessive disorder, I think, where China is concerned.
Now, and you happen to represent India in China just as that was really coming to the fore. That particular period, hosting the Olympics, dealing with the great financial crisis that so devastated, much of the West and had an impact, of course, elsewhere. I'd like you to say something about being an ambassador, being the representative of India in China and in the United States. How is it different? How are the tools different? How are the issues different in trying to do that? You had the experience in India or in China, and then after your term as Foreign Secretary, came to the United States as India's top representative here. Can you say something about how the work is different?
Yeah, the two worlds, China world and America's world, let's put it that way, they're very, very different. And I have always maintained that despite the fact that China opened up and reformed its economy starting from the early 1980s, and in a very dramatic way from the early 1990s after Deng Xiaoping's southern expedition, the fact is the diplomacy and the kind of attitudes at the government level of the Chinese Communist Party, the way the International Liaison Department of the Communist Party works, the way the Chinese Foreign Ministry works, just the structure, the language of diplomacy, all that has not changed very much, despite the fact that, China today is integrated in many ways with the rest of the world. And Chinese themselves are very visible outside China. But the way their establishment works and the language, the scripting, you know, just the vocabulary, is still, I always say, I call it the diplomacy of the long march even today. And so when you live in China, although you can make friends with ordinary Chinese, it's not very easy because language is always a barrier, as you know, for foreigners, unless they know Chinese and they know Chinese well enough. But dealing, it's a very closed society in that sense, in terms of the government echelons, the structure, the establishment. So it's so different. Of course, it's a vast and fascinating country, and when you travel to various parts of China, you learn a lot about the country. You meet interesting people, and you're able to pick up the signals as you discover various parts of the country. But America, you know, India and America are kindred democracies, and one never felt one was in a distant or very foreign country when one lived in America. I think the nature of our relationship, the nature of the networks existing between our two countries, ties of kinship also today, not just ties between government, all that make the experience of an Indian living and working in the United States so different. I mean, even if you're not a diplomat, but as a diplomat too, I mean, you're able to make real friendships, and you understand the levels of candor, openness, and mutual confidence in dealing with each other, which we don't have with the Chinese.
Well, one of the things that we might hope for is that more of the students from India and from China, the two largest groups on American campuses, hopefully they will find more opportunities to mix and to better understand each other. And perhaps, over the generations, we can affect some sort of change. We only have a couple.
I'd like to give a shout out to the Chinese students at Brown University who were my research interns when I was writing this book. It was wonderful dealing with them.
Yeah, no, it is one of the wonderful things here in the United States is that the world does come, and we have those kinds of opportunities. A couple questions that we've received from the audience, and I'm mindful of the clock here. That one question is, well, is there anybody who's considered by both India and China to be an honest enough broker to help to facilitate some sort of resolution?
Well, the simple answer is no, I'm afraid no. I think we are two proud nations, and I'm sure the way we look at it, the perspective that we have is we need to sit down and settle these problems. Nobody else is going to be able to settle it for us or to fight our battles.
Yeah, a third of humanity lives in either China or India. And so it's really important for these enormous countries, important countries, to find a way forward. And it will, as you suggest, rely on the people of the two countries to make happen. Another person asks, Americans don't know enough about India. What can be done to change that?
Mm-hmm. Well, talking about knowing enough about India, the Chinese know much less than the Americans know about India. But I think Americans, you have literally inherited, when you're born into the United States, you literally live in the lap of the gods, I would put it in some way, because you're such a naturally well-endowed country. You have the resources, you have the standards of living. Your ties, if at all, when you mention ties of the majority of Americans, are basically to Europe and to the Western world. So you see yourself as a Western country, although in California, where you are, when you see the Pacific Ocean, you know that there in the West, literally, there in the West lies Asia, like Mark Twain, the statue in St. Louis in Missouri has this statue of there in the East lies India, but there in the West really lies Asia. And that awareness, I think, has to become deeper and deeper in the average American's sensibility about our part of the world. Well, I think the intelligentsia and the people in the universities, more and more, there are India studies programs and India centers, which I hope can help accelerate an understanding and study of India, which is what we need, which is what happened as far as China was concerned. The body of expertise and knowledge and know-how and awareness of China, I think, is so well developed. For that matter, even in Russia, you know, I served in Russia and I found the quality of their China experts was outstanding. So that is the kind of, for India too, we need to develop that body of knowledge and understanding, both about China and the United States. People like me growing up, when I was growing up in India, well, I came from an English-speaking background, and although my parents were not terribly well-to-do, there was no dearth of books to read, and books we read, the literature that came into our hands was, one had read all the American classics. One even read American comics. My father was somebody who would even buy American comics for us to read. So we were very aware of America. That sort of understanding perhaps doesn't exist among American children of India. So I think you have to start in the schools. You have to watch, maybe Bollywood should become a little more available in the United States. I think Netflix and some of these streaming platforms are doing a lot, I think, to bring Indian movies and Indian stories to American audiences. So gradually, I hope the universe does open a little more, as I've heard said. That I hope will happen. I think with this relationship between India and the US, I think our relationship with the US is our most important foreign policy relationship today. So despite what is happening on Russia or Ukraine, setting that aside, I think this is a very strong relationship that has the capacity to endure and to grow stronger.
And I'm mindful that our minders at the World Affairs Council need to close this off. But if I might ask just one last question and ask for as short as possible an answer, even though it may be the most important question. And that is, we've been focusing on zones of contention. Talk with us for a moment about zones of cooperation. Clearly, we have a need for absolutely existential cooperation on climate change. But where are the spaces for cooperation between India and China? We certainly see it in business. Chinese investment into India is dampening now, the collapse of Paytm and things like that. But maybe you could say something about cooperation, and we can end with that.
Cooperation with China already really exists on the ground when you talk of the vast amounts of trade between the two countries, and the fact that we've continued to import so much from China despite what has happened in Galwan. I think multilaterally contacts and dialogue do continue. And at the official level, at the level of the militaries, channels of communication are open. But it's not an easy relationship. And I think that there are aspects of it, key aspects of it that need fixing, need attention. And that has to happen at the highest political level. So if you ask me, these prospects, the potential for cooperation between India and China is certainly immense. But I believe as the two countries have grown more powerful, more, they've built their capacities, let us say, on various fronts, the differences between them also tend to become accentuated, because underlying all this is that sense of competition, that need, to outbid the other. You've seen that happening in South Asia. South Asia, in our neighborhood, it's essentially been turned into an arena of competition between India and China. And our neighbors, our smaller neighbors, India's smaller neighbors, have tried to play this balancing game, playing India off against China, China off against India. But I think the way South Asia is looking at Sri Lanka, for instance, now with the crisis they're facing, India becomes the first responder. China is not that first responder.
You describe, and thank you so much for that, you describe the relationship now as combative coexistence, that there are all of these different fronts. And you've highlighted the role of nationalism, that if leaders are using nationalism to mobilize, that accentuates the differences and makes cooperation perhaps a good deal more difficult. For all of those out there, I read the book on Kindle. You can get the book, you can order it. And if you'd like, I just learned today that you could have Ambassador Rao read her words to you. There's an audible version of the book available as well. So thank you. I want to turn things back to Rick Putnam and the World Affairs Council. Thanks for making all this happen.
Thank you so much, Clay.
Thank you, Clay. And thank you, Ambassador Rao, so much for joining us from so far away. It's really wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Lisa, also for your moderation. It was a great program today. I also want to thank our partners, the Center for New American Security and the USC US-China Institute, and our other WACs around the country. It is these types of programs which provide real-world insight into our global issues that provide so much value to our Southern California community. And speaking of that, I want to remind you that we do rely on donations to a great extent, and to keep our programming coming at nominal cost, please make free use of the donate button on our website. We super welcome your and appreciate your generosity in anything you're able to provide. We also have a great slate of programs scheduled in the coming months, which you can view on our website as well. And we're happy to say that we're also returning to many in-person events. So while the webinars have been great for access and frequency, we all want to get back to see each other and experience our wonderful speakers in person. So please look forward to those. Upcoming events include an early evening interview on April 20th with former Congressman and CIA officer Will Hurd on the topic of getting big things done in the US at the West and South Coast. And then on May 17th, we'll welcome US Navy Admiral Phil Davidson at the Pacific Club for a dinner discussion titled Timely Perspectives on Our Nation's Security. We certainly hope to see you at these events. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.